Good morning, students. I am Dr. Vijay Bhandari. So let's start with the fourth unit, database transactions. Now, the database transactions. Before we proceeding, here I will cover firstly the definition of database transactions. Secondly, what is the database transactions and facts about database transactions. And after that, I will cover why do we need concurrency in transactions. And after that, I will conclude the lectures and doubt sessions. So a database transaction is a logical unit of processing in a DBMS which entails one or more database access operations, right? So first of all, I will explain you the database transactions representations. So database transactions represents real world events of any enterprise. As we can see here, the definition of database transaction. Okay, so a database transaction is a logical unit of processing in a DBMS which keeps one or more database access operations, right? The database transactions represents real world events of any enterprise. It means the all the types of database access operations which is held between the beginning and transactions. Statements are considered as a single logical transaction in DBMS. During these transactions, the database is inconsistent. Only once the database is committed, the state is changed from one consistent state to another, right? So before we going to the definition of transactions, and we will cover in this diagram. As we can see in this diagram, the database in an inconsistent state, and after that database may be temporarily in an inconsistent state during execution, and lastly the database in an inconsistent state. So in left hand side you can see the begin transactions, and right hand side the end transactions, and in middle the execution of transactions, right? So here we can see the states of the transactions. So the various states of the transactions concepts in DBMS, right? So firstly, the database in a consistent state, it means it is in active state. So a transaction enters into an active state when the execution process begins. During these states, read or write operations can be performed. Now we will talk about database may be temporarily in an inconsistent state during execution. So it means it is in partially committed. The transaction goes into the partially committed states after the end of the transactions. And after that, the committed states, when the transaction is committed to states, it has already completed its execution successfully. Moreover, all the changes are recorded to the database permanently. After that, we will talk about the failed states. So I hope so. It is clear to all. After that, I will explain you failed states. So a failed state transaction considered failed when any one of the checks fails, or if the transaction is aborted while it is in the active state. So here we will continue the terminated states. This is the last states of the transactions, right? So database in a consistent state means it will save all the transactions and it is committed. Now we can terminate states. State of the transactions reaches termination states when certain transactions which is leaving the systems cannot be restarted, right? So this is all about the execution of the transactions. Okay, so here the highlighted diagram you can see and understand very easily. So I will give you some tips of DBMS transactions. So you might be remembering about the DBMS transactions. So once a transaction states execution, it becomes active. It can issue read or write operations, right? After that, if you once the read and write operations completed, the transactions becomes partially committed states. We need some recovery protocols to ensure that a system failure will not result in an inability to record changes in the transactions permanently. So if this checks is a success, the transaction commits and enters into the committed states. After that, if the check is a fail and the transactions goes to the fail states, right? And lastly, we will cover the transaction is aborted while it is in the active states and it goes to the failed states. The transaction should be rolled back to the undo the effect of its write operations on the database, and the terminated state refers to the transaction leaving the system. So there is a facts about the database transactions. A transaction is a program unit whose transactions may or may not change the contents of database. The transaction is executed as a single unit, and if the database operations do not update the database but only the retrieve the data, this type of transaction is called a read-only transactions, as I told you in last slide. A successful transaction can change the database from one consistent state to another state. So you can see previous diagram. Okay, so DBMS transactions must be atomic, consistent, isolated, and durability. So I will cover these topics in next lectures. Okay, so I will request to attend the lecture of second of the database transactions. If the database were in an inconsistent state before a transaction, so it would remain in the inconsistent state after the transactions. So you might be clear all the transactions facts, right? Now, why do we need concurrency in transactions? We need concurrency in transactions. A database is a shared resources accessed. It is used by many users and processes concurrently. Concurrently means here parallel, we are going to be performing parallel processes, right? So for example, the banking systems, railway, air reservation systems, stock market, monitoring, supermarket inventory. You can see many examples in around the world, right? So it is not managing concurrent access may create issues like hardware failure, system crashes, concurrent execution of the same transactions, deadlocks or slow performance. So I will cover these topics in next lecture, right? So you might be understanding the need of the concurrency in transactions, right? So if any doubt, so please ask me. Thank you. Thanks for the day.